Welcome to Series 4 of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. We are delighted to be hosting this series and have an engaging program lined up today. My name is Katina Michael, and I'm the Director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. And I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society. Together with my wonderful co-host, Dr. Robert Abbas of the University of Wollongong, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Business and also the chair of the Socio-Technical Systems Committee at IEEE, we would like to acknowledge the work and support of Melissa Waite and the events team at the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. Before we commence our session, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the series to date. We journeyed from Series 1, which focused on values, responsible innovation, and COVID-specific technological responses, to Series 2, which centered on storytelling, imagination, and participatory design methodologies, to Series 3, which emphasized the global perspective with respect to the social, regulatory, and ethical considerations relevant to the design, development, and delivery of technology in the public interest. In this series, Series 4, we illuminate a path toward transdisciplinarity, hosting international speakers who will share their perspectives on experts and expertise, innovation ecosystems, multi-stakeholder approaches, and opportunities and challenges relating to addressing complex socio-technical challenges. Today's session is comprised of two presentations. Our first speaker we're introducing is Ms. Mariana Zafeirakopoulos. Mariana is a transdisciplinary thinker and practitioner in the intersection between national security, strategic intelligence, and the role of design in complexity and shaping futures, a theme close to my own heart. For over 15 years, Mariana has worked for the Australian government, in international organizations, academia, and private practice, exploring topics of emergence and complexity in shaping desirable futures for communities. She's also, amazingly, currently doing a PhD exploring the role of design in innovating strategic intelligence practice, something that we definitely require. Mariana has worked on topics including serious and organized crime, sexual assault prevention, and supporting youth to design their future lives. A very warm welcome, Mariana, to the Public Interest Technology Colloquium, and we're so happy to be hosting you today. What an honor.
Thank you very much for having me, Katina, and a warm welcome to you all. Before I get into my presentation, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I'm connecting to you all here from the Eora Nation, and I want to acknowledge the Gadi people upon whose ancestral lands I am connecting to you from. I would like to pay respects to elders past, present, and future, acknowledging them as traditional custodians of knowledge for the land that we're on here in Australia. I'd also like to extend any acknowledgement to our traditional custodians internationally, wherever you are. So a warm welcome to you all, and especially if there are traditional custodians here in the room today. Thank you again, Katina, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really humbled to be in front of you all and to have the opportunity to talk about my experiences. As you know, my name is Mariana Zafeirakopoulos, and I've worked in national security contexts, including geopolitics and serious and organized crime at the intersection of national security for a long time. And in that time, I worked primarily as a trainer, an educator, and also a practitioner, specifically strategic intelligence. And I still train in strategic intelligence and often mock strategic products from time to time. And working in the strategic space reminds me that national security is often viewed by the community and by our politicians that it's about the defense of our nation. But in reality, it's much more complex than that. It involves many interconnected systems like health, community cohesion, education, just to name a few. And it's my experiences working, training, and researching in these complex contexts, as well as having practiced in design that I want to be able to share with you today in this talk about the role that abductive reasoning might be able to open us up to thinking about national security in different ways. So what will I be covering in my talk today? There are three components, I suppose. The first, I want to give you a bit of context in the run-up to the challenge as I see it, and I'll finish up with talking about the opportunity around abductive reasoning. The context I'll be covering three main components. The first around a really quick introduction to intelligence and what it is. I will then introduce you to a decision-making framework. Perhaps many of you have already come across it beforehand, and also introduce you to existing forms of reasoning used by the intelligence function to think about these different problem frames, different frames for helping us make decisions. So let me get started by introducing us to intelligence and how we perceive it. Intelligence analysis often has a couple of memes or tropes, if you will. It's either the 007 spy, Hollywood style, very violent representation of someone operating behind the scenes, or it's perceived as something whereby an analyst has access to real-time data in very sophisticated technology settings, and uses that real-time data to be able to make very accurate decisions in the moment. The reality of what intelligence practice is, and although it is true that technology is making a lot of intelligence practice much easier, the reality is that intelligence is not a discipline or profession that is about giving accurate pinpoint information at any given time. It's about operating in fuzzy contexts where often information is incomplete, often information is unknown, and it's working with that incomplete information landscape to, in essence, give best guesses or hunches based on solid reasoning and solid structuring and analysis of information to these decision makers. So let me go into that in a little bit more depth. Intelligence analysis, the reality is its function, its fundamental role is to give decision makers an advantage over an adversary or a competitor. And as analysts, we do that by providing unbiased information that is has assumptions that are tested. The analysis must be objective as much as possible. So although intelligence analysis operates in quite a fuzzy space, there's a lot of emphasis on providing decision makers, whether that's a policy person or a senior minister, or it could be indeed someone in a completely different government portfolio, analysis that gives them an idea of probability. Intelligence analysis, though, doesn't just operate in government. It operates in a range of different contexts. It could be military, it could be business, but increasingly we know that intelligence has a legitimate function in private enterprise and private practice. You already know that I've had my experience in intelligence has been in a law enforcement, national security space, but increasingly we're seeing the tradecraft of intelligence being taught to tech companies as well as large corporations, whether that's looking at real estate or different markets in terms of large shopping centers. Intelligence is popping up as a really important function in a range of different environments. Fundamentally, what's common across these different contexts is that it's about identifying risk, threat, and harm, and providing options to those senior decision makers about how to reduce, treat, mitigate, or ameliorate those risks, threats, and harms. Fundamentally, that's what intelligence analysis is meant to do. It's meant to help decision makers get a sense of what potential risk might be at play and how to manage it, treat it, or deal with it. But they do that across three different spectrums. It's often viewed that intelligence analysis is one homogeneous discipline, but in reality, it's got three components: tactical, operational, and strategic. And it's important for me to just quickly explain the difference between those, because my focus in this talk is really around strategic intelligence, and I just want to emphasize that it is a different role compared to tactical and operational spaces. So in the short term, in the tactical space, this is a very reactive or maybe responsive function to an immediate situation. So perhaps it's seizing weapons or identifying targets that might commit a potential terrorist attack, or perhaps it's targeting an individual who might be wanting to disrupt a public infrastructure system, for example, a telecommunications or energy provider. Operational intelligence is more short to medium term, and it's trying to shift away from being responsive to more proactive by identifying patterns and trends over time. And operational intelligence's function is really about trying to get an overview of how these patterns are evolving, to identify opportunities to disrupt networks. So in the example of a public infrastructure system disruption, operational intelligence might be trying to understand whether that individual belongs to a network, whether they have underlying political motivators that might want to target a system more broadly. The strategic focus of intelligence, therefore, is more future leaning, it's more future focused, and it forms its assessment based on themes, and it's really looking to, in the future, in 5, 10, 15 years' time, what type of vulnerabilities might exist and how might we mitigate those. So in our public infrastructure system example, what potential vulnerabilities might exist for public infrastructure systems? How do we harden that system so that it's less likely to be disrupted, whether it's for political motivators or commercial reasons and so on? The important point to take away is that the function of strategic intelligence is very much about identifying opportunities to remove vulnerabilities in the system. And that's what makes it quite unique compared to tactical and operational contexts, which tend to deal with more immediate requirements and with information that is either knowable or known. Which leads me to a quick introduction to different categorization of problem sets. How do we identify different problem sets? How do we know what type of problem we're working on? Many of you may already have come across the Conifer Framework. I don't know if there's a quick show of hands over Zoom if you've heard of the Conifer Framework beforehand. The Conifer Framework is not new. It's been around for over 20 years, and the function of the Conifer Framework is about helping decision makers to diagnose a problem. And as a quick introduction, there are different categories of problems. In the obvious realm, this is the realm of best practice. So this is helping us think about problems that can be known. So they may not be easily identifiable at the time, but we have routine processes that can help us identify the answers to the problems that we have. So for example, if we look at the current Optus data breach here in Australia, one could argue that this should have been an obvious problem to ensure that the authentication process or processes were in place to prevent access to software interfaces, basically to ensure best practice was employed to protect customer data. In the complicated realm, you can argue that educating users or employees on malware and viruses is an example of a complicated problem. So it's a great idea for all people to have excellent education on these things. It's an example of good practice, but the reality is that most users have quite basic education on malware and viruses. So this is the realm of knowable problems. We might not know all the processes at the time, but eventually we can work it out. In the complex realm, often what we're looking at, the situation that we're looking at, makes sense in hindsight. the approach to a complex problem requires us to do some probing first. So that could be through some experimentation, and it's the realm of emergent practice. We don't really have good processes or standards for us to lean on, because we can't make sense of the problem that we're faced with. So if we think about the example of artificial intelligence, it might be how we preserve safety or prevent harm being perpetuated to vulnerable communities. Again, if we think back to this Optus example, in a complex realm, how might these personal data sets be exploited 5 years from now? Something that may have begun as an obvious problem, potentially the failure to adopt best practice. This is still an emerging situation. We're learning more about it each time, but I'm just using this as an example. The complex spin-off of this problem are the human breaches that have happened from this. How do we build trust amongst communities with large corporations? There's a lot that's unknown about this that will come to fruition with the passage of time. The last realm is the chaotic realm, and this is the space of novel practice. So in this example, what if all telecommunications companies had all their data breached tomorrow? That would be quite an unprecedented event that would require quite a novel intervention in that moment. So I just wanted to quickly introduce the Conifer Framework for those who haven't come across this before, as a way of thinking about different problem sets, and importantly, to connect it back to intelligence. I would argue that tactical intelligence, that realm of being responsive, is really operating at that chaotic and obvious problem sets. We're dealing with targets, people that we can uncover and learn about. Operational intelligence that's dealing across networks and evolving patterns over time, arguably is in that complicated space, where strategic intelligence is very much focused on complex and emerging problems. And that's really the focus of my interest, my practice, and my experience. So let me, to close off this bit around context, giving you context to the nature of the problem, I want to finish this section by introducing you to some concepts of reasoning or rationality that's used for these problem categories. So there are 3 different types: deduction, induction, and abduction. I'm simplifying it, but in essence, deduction is the process of making a logical argument by applying known facts, definitions, and properties to the laws of logic. So this often presents itself in the form of if-then statements. So for example, if something is true, then something else might be true. For example, if we think of a sporting competition, if the Sydney Swans, which is a popular team here in Australia, defeats the Geelong Cats, then they will move to the next round in this sporting competition. The what is the sporting team, the how is they beat another team in a competition, which leads to the next round. In inductive reasoning, it's the logic of combining observations with information to reach a conclusion. If we think back to Hollywood, some of the Sherlock Holmes movies, or if you read Sherlock Holmes incorrectly, they refer to, they use the language of deduction, or Sherlock Holmes deduces things in the movies, but in fact, he's actually making an induction. So in one part of the film, or one of the films, Sherlock Holmes observes a suntan mark on a woman's finger of where a wedding band used to be, and makes an inference that that woman was once married. So in that context, an observation is being made about a tan, which leads to an outcome, a judgment that that person used to be married. Abduction, and I've got normal abduction because later I will talk about how it's evolving, but abduction is an argument to the best explanation. It's often described as a hunch or hypothesis, and it's come from the pragmatist philosopher Charles Peirce, who recognized that inductive and deductive reasoning weren't forms of logic that led to scientific discovery. There was something else at play here. Charles Peirce recognized that generating a hypothesis is actually a creative act, and inductive and deductive reasoning weren't the things that helped one get to that point of a creative leap. And so abductive reasoning was something that was generated from that observation. An example that I might be able to give you is one, if I can offer, is one of the discovery of the Iguanodon. The Iguanodon, type of dinosaur back in the Triassic period, I believe, was discovered by the wife of a novice paleontologist. Her name was Anne Mantell. And when they discovered the bones of the Iguanodon, one of the pieces of bones that they discovered was this spiky horn piece. And because it was based, abductive reasoning is based on experience, at the time they thought that the spur was a horn that would go at the end of the dinosaur's head. But what we now know many years later is that the Iguanodon spike actually belongs on the thumb of the animal. It's a spike at the pointy bit at the end of the hand that you can see there on the screen. But this took a long time and some creative exploration to get to that point. For those who might respond better to a visual representation of the difference between these forms of reasoning, inductive reasoning is a way of generalizing existing ideas. Deductive reasoning is about narrowing down existing choices. And abductive reasoning can be thought of as a way of creating space to generate new ideas. So this leads me to the challenge. After quite a run up, here's the leap that we land to, the challenge. And as I see it, strategic intelligence does a lot of good and has a really important role to play. Pardon me. But it's probably being hampered in terms of how much it can shift existing national security challenges. And it's not the fault of strategic intelligence. It's been around for a long time and we've got these very solid and existing norms. But strategic intelligence is operating in its own organizational, messy, networked, complex space. So it's not my task here today to critique or criticize strategic intelligence, because it does do a lot of very productive and important work. My task here, as I see it, is to open up the landscape to some intractable parts of the problem and finish this talk with some opportunities for us to explore together beyond this session. So let me launch into it. I want to explain my top 5 aporias, my top 5 puzzles, paradoxes, tensions, 2 opposing things that both stand alone as true, but make it quite difficult for strategic intelligence to take creative problem solving seriously and therefore shift national security in the way that we think about it in fundamentally different ways. So the first aporia, the first sort of challenge as I see it, is that abductive reasoning has a place for all problems. In that Conifer Framework, it probably has an important function to play across all types of problem spaces. But intelligence in a national security setting in particular is perceived as a science, which means that intuitively and explicitly, because we teach it and we're taught it, we reject this notion. We reject this practice of creativity as a place that sits within science or has a legitimate space. Intelligence, like my example of the Iguanodon in a science context, is a creative process, but it's not something that is endorsed. The second point is that leads me to is that science as an objective discipline, how it's perceived. This positivist paradigm is effective for known problems. If we think back to tactical intelligence problems, things that can be known, information that can be discovered, positivism works really well. But we also know that other parts of intelligence, like strategic intelligence, operates in complex and emerging future problems, whether that's the role that 3D printers will have in printing weaponry years from now, or the potential harm that the exploitation of people's data might have in other contexts. The third point is that intelligence analysis, by its very name and labeling, is reductionist. It's got the word analysis in there. Analysis is the act of taking a system, breaking it up into its individual parts, and analyzing those individual components. We also know that analysis doesn't work well in systems context. We need other approaches. And again, strategic intelligence is operating in these emerging futures which impact multiple systems. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned how national security is not just about the defense of a nation. It includes health, it includes education, and that by definition means it involves the public. My fourth point there is that problem framing is reinforced in national security because it's perceived as a defense or offensive positionality. What this means is we cannot unlock ourselves from that problem frame. The solutions that we generate come from the problems as we see it. And this is a problem, or this is a challenge, because it meets current expectations. I mentioned earlier that intelligence is all about informing and supporting risk and preventing it. And that's what our politicians, our managers, our clients, pardon me, expect us to provide. But it doesn't shift the problem. It doesn't fundamentally change it. As I mentioned, I still teach strategic intelligence, and years later, when I read mock strategic intelligence products, I see risk ratings move up and down, whether that's the import and export of drugs, or a different serious and organized crime problem, or problems at the prisons. The risk rating is just moving up and down. It doesn't actually fundamentally solve the problem or change the problem frame. Finally, this relates to stable national security training. Yes, we make incremental improvements to how training is executed and done, and how we improve our education about national security, but our contexts are shifting and other disciplines are attending to this. And so there's an opportunity for us to learn from these other disciplines. And so let me then present to you the opportunity as I see it. We've now run up through the context. I've given you some explanation around what intelligence is, what different problems exist in the different types of reasoning. I've also explained the challenge as I see it around strategic intelligence having limited capacity to shift national security problems because it's stuck in this reinforcing way of thinking and working. So what might we be able to do? How might we be able to learn from these other disciplines and ways of thinking? Those other disciplines, I mentioned design as one of them, futures thinking is another, but we also draw from other enduring approaches such as systems thinking as well. Abductive reasoning is evolving based on these other approaches. And my practice as well as my research suggests that abductive reasoning is a legitimate form of rationality and creative practice. What we're seeing in the work of Roger Watson and Case Dorst, for example, is this idea of design abduction, that actually we can use creative exploration as a way of helping us think about the outcome that we want, a values-based approach to help us imagine what outcome we'd like to see. And then from there, through a process of creative exploration, through experimentation and learning, we can then work out how we get there and what we need to get there. So creative abduction requires a transdisciplinary approach. Transdisciplinarity to me is about bringing together different disciplines as well as human ways of knowing to create new knowledge, new ways of understanding. So let me tell you a little bit more about it. I really like this quote from Martin in Colco, who says that abductive reasoning, or this is the logic of what might be. And I think that can be a really powerful way of helping us think about national security contexts and problems. What might be? And if we think about some of the challenges that I introduced us to and the role of intelligence in this space, I come back to some enduring key quotes that I really love from Akov on systems thinking. It says that, pardon me, a system improvement might be directed toward what you want and not what you don't want. So if we're going to improve our national security systems, then we can only go so far with these reinforcing problem frames. If we continue to think about risk, harm, and threat, then we're just locking ourselves in this cycle of thinking. It's not actually shifting us towards what we want. We're just locking ourselves into thinking about what we don't want. We don't want harm to come to us. We don't want our vulnerabilities to be exploited. These are, of course, important things, but they don't unlock us towards what the ideal state is. Another quote, which I think is really powerful to think through, again from Acknowledgement on his work on systems thinking, quite an enduring quote, is that you can only leapfrog a leader through creativity. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned the key function of intelligence is to provide decision makers with an advantage, with an edge, and you cannot do that through incremental improvement. To make fundamental changes, you need creative leaps to do that, to provide something different. To leapfrog a leader or leapfrog an adversary, we need a fundamentally different way. So I think that we can do this by creating desirable futures with people that live in them, that live in those futures. And abductive reasoning can help us think, if we can respect abductive reasoning as a rationality in its own way, we can start to think about these possibilities. So what might be some principles of how we get to the logic of what might be? I have some principles that I think could be quite helpful. I do think that we need to work with other people and respect our individual and collective humanness, our lived experience, as well as our expert knowledge as legitimate forms of helping us to create these futures. We know that expert knowledge will only take us so far. And again, borrowing from disciplines like participatory design, complexity systems thinking, I think that we should be teaching, endorsing, and practicing sense-making first and foremost, because sense-making is the opposite of analysis. Intelligence analysis, the breaking down of individual parts, is not going to help us look at the system as a whole. And this is going to help us engage with how people make sense of their world, and that connects us to constructivism as a paradigm. And this is a really unexplored area of intelligence in particular, but national security as well. Currently, positivism, intelligence practice as a science, is what is postulated as a legitimate mental frame of thinking about how we go about the world. I argue that constructivism, teaching that, can help us really think about the way that we're creating knowledge through our own systems. I'm not saying that we should be replacing positivism as a paradigm. What I am saying, for complex contexts in national security settings, constructivism has a legitimate role to play, because together with our own experiences, our own meaning, we can help generate our sense of the systems that we're living in, or we want to live in. That connects to knowledge co-production. I think that being able to produce knowledge, produce an understanding and meaning in our world, shouldn't be something that just analysts do behind a computer. We're inherently collaborative, creative, and motivated people, but we can only do so much. And it's true, I would argue, that at least in our context here in Australia, the Australian government is working quite hard to think about how we open up democratic dialogue with community better. But I think there's more to go in a national security space in terms of how we do this with community. How do we co-produce knowledge around our national security challenges that affect us all in society? With that in mind, I think we need to legitimize creative problem solving as a form of rationality. If it helps, we can see it as a type of science, but it's not just for the sake of creativity for the sake of it. Which leads me to future shaping as a future forming piece of work rather than future informing. We need to find a way of fracturing this problem solution reinforcing frame. We can't shape the future that we want in national security settings if we continue to work in existing mental loops. We're not going to be able to actually shift towards a world and environment that we want. So what does abductive thinking do for us? What does it open us to? My job here in this presentation, as I said, isn't to give you all the answers, but what I want to offer are some possibilities, some counterfactuals to get us thinking about what might things be? What if national security was a system that somehow was more inclusive of communities to help shape these desirable futures together? What if we framed national security as a system of care, or a system that was serving us, rather than a system that was about defending our nation necessarily, or in addition to? What would that look like if national security was a system of care? What would it look like if we had additional functions in national security governments that were responsible for thinking about, designing and strategizing these new frames to emerging problems, to imagine these desirable and evolving futures? And what if we could think about the public being involved in these conversations about emerging problems, like our public interest in technology? So I want to leave us with some concluding points. We know that abduction is not a new concept. It's not formalized as its own rationality that can aid the creation of futures. I know that this paradigm doesn't exist in current strategic intelligence practice, because I don't see it in the literature, I don't hear it in our conversations, and we don't see it, or I don't see it being taught in practice. I do see induction and deduction being taught, and we know that intelligence is actually a really creative, open, and quite experimental practice, and so are the analysts that are in it. And if there are practitioners, whether it's in America or places across the globe, that are really embracing this creative rationale, this way of working and thinking, it's such a shame that it's so difficult to access or engage with, because I think that it really holds significant potential for us to really shift national security problems in really fundamental ways. So in conclusion, I think that acknowledging abductive reasoning as its own form of rationality and logic can really help us generate new frames of problems, shifting away from this loop of thinking around risk, threat, and harm, to create futures that are desirable for us with communities. I think it holds the potential to legitimize the voice of humanity and humans living in this space, and can open us up to new ways of practicing in the world, particularly in this national security setting, something that's not traditionally seen as a place of creativity. So I really think that there are opportunities for how we might teach and do intelligence in the future. That's all for me. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my passion and my interest, experience, and research with you all. I have left my details there for anyone who would like to continue the conversation. Otherwise, I'm very open to any questions, feedback, or discussion that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for that wonderful overview, and may I say, delivered in very much a masterclass form. I've taken lots and lots of notes here on things that you've said, and to quickly recap, you've introduced us to the different types of problems in strategic intelligence. You've really defined for us deduction, induction, and abduction. You've told us about creative hypothesis, creating spaces to generate new ideas through this abductive reasoning approach. Talked about design abduction, as Dorst had presented it, and so many others that you've cited. And you've really hunkered down on this notion of transdisciplinarity, the need to do that in strategic intelligence, especially when we are using this new emerging approach that you're proving into your research. Again, a big shout out to the great Russell Ackoff, who was that systems thinker that really pushed us to think about, what do we want? What do we desire? It's almost as if we have that utopian vision in mind, not that dystopian. If we want to reach a dystopia, we just keep talking about dystopia. If we want to reach a utopia, perhaps our desirables, then we start talking about them loudly through perhaps scenarios. And I might ask you a question after we hear our next speaker on scenarios. But making sense of the world, creating a creative problem solving, almost reminds me of the Mintzberg creative planning and creative management styles, but creative problem solving and future shaping, constructivism, knowledge co-production, and this need to look at national security. I remember the term we used in around about 2010, an all hazards approach, one that wasn't just about terrorism or, the military response, but something beyond that. What is national security? And a plug for our SINS 22, our social implications of national security workshop that you're leading this year. on sustainability and the items of care and the importance of understanding national security in the context of sustainability. So these are the main takeaway points I get, Mariana, from this brilliant talk. We thank you so much, and we'll come back and loop back to you after we hear our next speaker. Our second speaker, if we share screen, for today's talk is Professor Gabriel Bammer. We are so fortunate to have you, Gabriel. I met you at a national security conference, I think it was around about 2013-14 with Dr. Roba Abbas, and you have stayed front and foremost in my mind with the research that you're leading at the Australian National University. You're a Professor of Integration and Implementation Sciences, I2S, and I stress that, Integration and Implementation Sciences for those listening, in the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health. Gabriel is developing the new Integration and Implementation Sciences discipline to improve research strengths for tackling complex societal and environmental problems. Please do visit i2s.anu.edu.au, and you also create the marvelous i2insights.org blog, which is very popular and a repository of growing thought in this transdisciplinarity space to do with the public interest, something I know that on Twitter I follow and repost as often as I can, but with wonderful blog posts, very rich in insight and future direction for us all who are watching and listening to you. Today, Gabriel will be giving a talk titled Effectively Using Transdisciplinary Approaches in Public Interest Technology. Over to you, Gabriel.
So thanks for that introduction, Katina, and thanks, Mariana. That was I've dabbled on the edges of this space that you're talking about, and that was a terrific bringing together of a whole lot of kind of fragments of information. And I hope you'll be willing to share your slides, because there's a lot of terrific information there. So I'm going to take us out more broadly into the kind of areas that I've been thinking about. And I'm going to talk a bit about transdisciplinarity in a broader context. And then I'm going to talk about particular aspects of transdisciplinarity. And I think there are some nice overlaps there with what Marianne talked about. And as part of that, I'm going to talk about some concepts and methods and other tools. And I'm going to be relying fairly heavily on I2 Insights, which is, as Katina said, both a blog and a repository that is trying to build a community of people who are trying to think about these things in a different way. But let me start off by talking about transdisciplinarity in context. So transdisciplinarity is useful for addressing complexity, and I'm not using it in the way that Mariana talked about it in the Conifer Framework. I'm using it a bit more loosely than that. But we think about transdisciplinarity mostly about problems like climate change or migration or social injustice, often on a fairly local scale, and it's useful for that kind of a problem addressing, if you like. It usually can't solve those problems, but it can move us forward on them. We think about it much less in terms of the we here is the transdisciplinary field, in terms of complex innovation. Yet it's not just about problem solving. You actually got to do innovative things as well. And I think that's the space that public interest technology is in. And the transdisciplinary field doesn't think about this as much as it should in terms of developing theory and practice. And this talk has been a great occasion for me to kind of expand my thinking in that area. It's also really important to say that transdisciplinarity doesn't adequately cover the whole terrain. There are people we've heard quite a lot about systems thinking in Mariana's talk, which I go here. There's an overlap between systems thinking and transdisciplinarity, which I won't go into, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that the systems thinkers think about. There's the post-normal scientists, there's the action researchers, there's the implementation scientists. There's a whole lot of others who are thinking about how do we deal with problems and how do we innovate, that transdisciplinarians could learn a lot from. And I've argued that these multiple approaches need an underpinning discipline, that kind of harvests and promotes and helps build the underpinning theory and practice, and have referred to that as integration and implementation sciences. So the idea is not to mush everything together. I think the individual approaches should maintain their integrity, but it's a way of sharing, as I've said, those relevant concepts and methods and other tools. And I'm going to talk about 3 clusters of tools. They're all relevant to transdisciplinarity, but formal transdisciplinarity is stronger in some of them than it is in others. And for this audience, that distinction is not particularly important, but happy to discuss it if that's of interest. So what's integration and implementation sciences trying to do? It's thinking about how do we develop a more comprehensive understanding of a complex problem, bringing together not only what we know, but also what we don't know. And Mariana touched on this in her talk. So we've got to bring together perspectives from different disciplines, from relevant stakeholders in terms of what they know about the problem. But we've also got to ask them, what are they thinking about? What are they concerned about? What is it that they don't know that keeps them awake at night, right? And it's bringing, and when you bring together what different people know and don't know, then you start to get a more comprehensive understanding of the issue that we're trying to deal with. It's trying to produce a greater range of ideas for addressing the problem, including what may and may not work. And then it's trying to provide a deeper and more effective insights into how research can support policy and practice action by government, business and civil society. So the idea is not to solve the problem. So let me just backtrack a minute. I'm coming at this, as you can probably tell from these set of slides, very much from the perspective of research and what research can do. And how research can, and by this I mean fairly traditional academic research, and how research can support policy and practice action in the real world. So integration and implementation sciences thinks about this in that, how do we deal with complex problems bit? It's not so good at thinking about this in terms of public interest technology, and I'm kind of curious I'm hoping we can have a conversation about how well these 3 points translate into that innovation, public interest technology space. Are they equally applicable there? Do they have to be modified a bit? As I said, it's not, so I've been thinking about this very much in one mindset and really valuing the opportunity here to translate that into a different mindset, because I think the ideas are also useful. So I am going to rely quite heavily on integration and implementation insights, because it's trying to do something that doesn't exist for our community. So it's aiming to share resources across these diverse fields, and it's aiming to build a community of people who are interested in this different way of operating. It started in November 2015. We've had more than 400 contributions, more than 500 authors from 47 countries. I'm really trying to make this a global effort. And one of the things that I'm really mindful of is that this is an area where the whole world can participate on a relatively even footing, that we're not in the West, we're pretty advanced, as Mariana said, in positivist types of thinking and reductionist types of thinking. We're all beginners when it comes to thinking in this more complex environment, and it would be super if that was done in a more globally connected way, and so that we learned from what people in India are doing around trying to preserve the knowledge of marginalised communities, for example. Anyway, it's got pretty wide readership, so there are only 5 countries that are part of the United Nations where the blog doesn't get read, or iTunes doesn't get read, and it's moderately successful. So each contribution gets about 750 views. This is, the ambition is to make it much more widespread than that, and I'm hoping that so that this talk might enthuse some of you to contribute your own insights and resources. And Marianne, I'm going to be following up with you on that count. So what I'm going to talk about in these three clusters of tools is really what the I2 Insights is indexed on. So it's indexed on diversity, stakeholder engagement, teamwork and integration, on systems, context and unknowns, and on this last set of things, which I can't see because I've got people's faces in front of it. It's always the problem when you're screen sharing, on change, decision-making, research, implementation and communication. So let me go through each of those and present some tools that might be useful. So let's start with diversity. So as I've said, if you want to have better thinking on complex problems, you need to bring more perspectives to the table. And it's not just gender, age, race, ability. Those are all obviously really important. There's more to diversity than that. It's also mental models, so the different ways people see the world, perceptions of what good research is, what our research standards are. It's also different ways of how we use and understand and use our influence or power. It's having people there with different values that care about different things, people with different interests that want different things, people there from different cultural backgrounds, and these are not just ethnic cultures, these are also the different social behaviours and norms that we belong to. People there with different personalities, which are the traits that predict our behaviours. And given that, as Mariana said, we need to work together, different team role skills, so have different abilities in working together. And I've been thinking about how this is relevant to public interest technology, I guess I've thought that it would provide more inputs into the ideas, the innovations that are developed and the different ways of thinking about implementing them. But these ideas also point to what it is that makes it hard for us to work together. So there's a limit in how much diversity we can actually cope with to work happily in an appropriate way together. And just to go back a minute, there's a primer on understanding diversity on the I2 Insights website that goes through all of these if anybody's interested. Stakeholder engagement, so it's one thing to identify that people are diverse, the other is how do you engage these diverse groups. So when you're working on a particular field, one of the things that it's worth thinking about is what's the definition of stakeholder. And I've found it helpful to define them as those who are affected by the problem that's being researched and those who are in a position to do something about it. And so how do you identify those people and how do you bring them together? And that's another primer series that's on I2 Insights. I want to cover one more thing about stakeholder engagement. So I'm going to be kind of doing this Cook's tour, I guess. While I support what Mariana said about co-production, the reality is that we often don't have time to co-produce, and it's important to also think about how do we interact with people in the work that we do. There's a framework here that I've developed, which is based on the International Association for Public Participation framework, about different ways of interacting with people. And it's important to be mindful not only about what you want to do, but what you can actually practically do. And the important piece of this is that there's also a promise, so that if you are involving other people in your work, you also have some obligations back to them about letting them really know what it is that you're involving them in and keeping them informed about it. And I'm going to end every slide with what's the relevance for public interest technology, because I'm really hoping to generate some discussion about that. I'm hoping that these ideas, I've tried to pick examples and ideas that I think would be relevant, but I'm really interested in a discussion about whether or not they are. So then if we talk about teamwork, so it's important for people to work together in bringing together different insights and engaging stakeholders. There's a useful tool that that was published this year on I2 Insights, which really goes through a process for establishing a joint vision and expectations when you're trying to work together. My hunch is that that's relevant. And then finally, let's talk about integration. And so, you can have this array of ideas, you can have this process for bringing them together and working together, both stakeholder engagement and teamwork, but then how do you mush it all together, which we generally refer to as integration. And integration can never be complete. There'll always kind of be outliers. And I think that the danger is that we're always trying to build a neat story, and then we tend to ignore the outliers, whether it's the outliers of what's going to come and bite us. So there's a contribution about the IPO model, which is to focus on inputs, process, and outputs. So really thinking about what is it we're bringing together, how are we bringing it together, and what's the new whole that we're trying to generate. Again, I'm hoping that's relevant. So then let's move to the next idea. We've already covered a little bit about systems. If you're not, we've talked about Ackoff, who's really important. There's some work by the Cabreras around, who are trying to reconceptualize systems thinking around what they call DSRP theory, which they argue is 4 universal patterns, distinctions. So the difference between things, and where you set boundaries, thinking in terms of parts and wholes, thinking in terms of relationships, and the importance of perspectives. So the importance of perspectives harks back to what I've been talking about in terms of diversity. Let's move on to context. So this is the first piece of work that actually comes from the transdisciplinary field, thinking about context dependent. So whatever you do in the field that we work in, unlike, we can't develop universal laws, although the Cabreras are giving it a red hot go, I have to say. But in general, the problems we address and the technologies we develop are very much dependent on context. And that is about what is in a research context. The transdisciplinarians think about it in terms of what influences the research design and the interpretation of the results. So who's involved? What are the social, cultural, political, and other conditions? And then what's the research setting? Are you doing this in your own country, or are you doing it in a different country? And then what are the factors you need to consider there? And then my favourite topic in the whole wide world, which is unknowns, and it was great to see Mariana talk about that. There's an awful lot to be said about the unknown. It's been hugely ignored for a very long time, but is now kind of coming into its own. One of the things that's really interesting from an innovation perspective is the innovation dilemma. So you don't know what modifications you need to make to an innovation early on, when it's still possible to make modifications so that you don't have adverse unintended consequences. You know what by the time you know what the adverse unintended consequences are, the innovation's already pretty deeply embedded and it becomes hard to modify it. And Yaakov Ben-Haim's been kind of thinking about how to manage that information dilemma. And he argues for making decisions that robustly satisfy critical requirements, which is that how do you need to identify the outcomes that are essential, that must be achieved, and then choose an alternative from an array of alternatives that give you the widest possibilities of trying to achieve those outcomes. And then let's move on to the last trio of ideas, which is about, so how do we think about change? And if you don't know about theory of change, you should, which is really about, we're all guided by a theory of change, but for most of us it's implicit. So it's how do we think change happens in a particular context? And what a theory of change does is it helps you identify the long-term goals and then maps backwards to identify the changes that are thought to be necessary to get to that goal. And it's a really useful tool for making you think in a systematic way about what it is that you're trying to achieve. it has one major problem, which is that it's mostly conceived of as being pretty linear, and it's not good for systems change. And systems change is, of course, where most change happens, and it's already complicated. And it's not so easy to trace those pathways. But the idea here is to really get people to start interrogating themselves and each other about how they think change happens, because we're never going to get good at realizing those utopian visions that Mariana talked about unless we think about what do we need to do to get there. How do we guide decision making? So there was, I think, Mariana, you've given us some terrific ideas around that. And Katina flagged the idea of talking about scenarios. There's a great contribution on I2 Insights by Bonnie McBain about that really teases out what scenarios are trying to do, their goals, the design, the use and defensibility, and things like highlighting important processes and decision points, about providing insights into what's possible, about providing visions of the future, and providing ideas about action. So scenarios have a great range of uses that I think are useful in the public interest technology space, but interested to talk about whether they are. A lot of the time what we're trying to do is to implement findings from research, and I2 Insights has a lot to say on research implementation. One example is these core competencies for implementation practice, which are about how do you inspire stakeholders to get involved, and how do you develop relationships with them? How do you build teams to implement? Interestingly, they do that before they try to understand the problem, which I think has some useful ramifications. So in kind of sparking the kind of creativity that Mariana was talking about. How do you use evidence to inform all aspects of implementation? How do you assess the context, et cetera, et cetera? Hopefully some useful ideas there. And then I want to finish, and so I'm sorry I've kind of been hurtling through this, mainly because I'm hoping we'll have some time for discussion. Let me finish with communication, and I'm going to bring in this example from New Zealand, mainly because the rest has been pretty Western, and I want to just remind us that we do live in a global world with other ways of viewing the world. The Māori in New Zealand have some terrific ideas about how to collaborate more effectively and how to communicate more effectively. And Paweri, which Russ Smith describes here, is about how do you weave together different unknowns? How do you weave together different energies? How do you protect the integrity of the person? How do you listen deeply? And how do you strengthen trust? And that's and these are things that I think it's really important to think about in the communication space. So this is, as I said, it's been kind of a quick tour through a small number of the resources that are available on I2 Insights. What I've tried to do is to give you some insights into the types of frameworks and tools that transdisciplinarity and allied areas can provide, and that I hope will help those of you interested in public interest technology, find things that will help advance your practice. I'm hoping we can discuss the relevance of what I've presented to public interest technology. And as I said right at the beginning, I'm hoping that we can improve the application of transdisciplinarity to innovation, which I think is a space that's under explored. And as I also have said a couple of times, I'm hoping that you might contribute to I2 Insights, both in terms of contributing posts, but also commenting on what other people's contributions. If you want to know more, there's a bunch of resources here. I should have also said right at the beginning that Katina has the slides. I'm very happy for them to be shared with anybody who wants them. So if you were frantically trying to take notes, I should have told you not to bother, because Katina can just give you the slides. Thanks very much.
What a incredible overview that was, and how generous of you, Gabriel. We will share those slides with anyone who requests them, and point back to I2 Insights, the blog and the repository and all your fine work at ANU. I was very touched that you kept coming back to public interest technology, Gabriel, as a theme that we need to come back to, not only for the Colloquium series, but also in essence, what is public interest technology and how do we achieve that through transdisciplinarity, and how important is transdisciplinarity to the whole field of public interest tech. I really appreciated that you began with reminding us that transdisciplinarians are just not generalists. They come equipped with a discipline and a background and strengths in perhaps more than one area, but that they don't just forget about that discipline and move on to make transdisciplinarity happen, but they're ingesting into that group their lived experience, their professional expertise in particular, and bringing it together. You gave us so many examples from the blog on joint visions, on the importance of systems and context, on looking at unknowns, at the theory of change. You know, what is that we are engaged in, if not one process of intervention after another, from a present mode of operation through some transformation to a future mode of operation, typically what we consider as systems thinking and systems design, albeit I may go as far as talking about design thinking. But this intervention, what's it for? What does it mean? And then you also talk to us about core competencies. And that's really important. I think stakeholder engagement and other themes you touched on. The essence that you said, that if we include people, if we are inclusive, and perhaps co-design is not for every project you identified, but perhaps some level of participation through the taxonomy you developed, Gabriel. How do we involve people, but also keep them engaged? And we are obligated as researchers and as practitioners to continually tell and share with individuals how their own submissions and contributions are being utilized. I think these are all things to take away and give us a very, very robust sense of transdisciplinarity. Gabriel, you reached out to us a number of times during the talk to say, well, how does this intersect with public interest technology? And I'm going to share my screen as a very short interlude and response through work that Dr. Roba Abbas, Professor Jeremy Pitt at Imperial College London, and also myself have engaged in. Is public interest technology a philosophy? Is it an end goal? Is it a process? And one of our publications from last year, I identify it as a number of things. But here you can see a process in which we hopefully provide context, we hopefully provide stakeholder identification, those values that you were mentioning, that level of participation, the importance of technology, laws that you alluded to, and other things that we might develop or may need addressing or may need to be abided by. But we're there to go through a process together by which, you know, truly it is a socio-technical intervention. But then what comes out of it, I think, is what you pressed us for. And does this kind of diagram, this process, require transdisciplinarity? I would love to hear, Gabriel, from you on what do you see as public interest technology? How do you think transdisciplinarity intersects with your research?
What's interesting to me is the intersection between what the Americans call convergence research and that focus on innovation. It's trying to delve a bit deeper, and I think I think Mariana kind of, for me, Mariana kind of captured it in her talk, which is about going past the kind of mechanical determination of here I am, the researcher, thinking about what's going to be good for you, the public, and maybe make me some money in this at the same time. But, you know, I guess the money-making bit goes out of it, and it's really thinking about what's good for the public. Well, you can only think about what's good for the public if the public are involved in making that decision. But I think, Mariana, your idea about how do we bring creativity into it, and I think for me there's something about that which I can't really kind of capture eloquently on the spur of the moment, but that's the bit that I want to kind of tease out. And then transdisciplinarity for me provides a bunch of tools for doing that.
Well, that's an interesting segue. Mariana, I'm interested in your response to Gabriel, but also you mentioned communicating complexity to the public in engaging them in future directions and future impacts of things. Could you comment on Gabriel's presentation and her question and reflections and this link back to the public?
I think it's a great question, and thank you, Gabriel, for the presentation. Also really wonderful to hear that there's moments of convergence and commonality in our thinking. Always nice as a researcher and a practitioner to know that you're not operating in a vacuum. I think it's a great question to ask, Katina. Like Gabriel, I don't have a crisp answer. One thing I would say is part of my thinking in this space is that it's not about, as Gabriel suggested, it's not about doing to community. And so it's more about opening up how might we and start to open up these spaces for engagement with community. And I'm aware of a number of existing practices around democratic dialogue and discursive approaches that governments use to try and better connect with community. I guess what I've been thinking about in my research and my practice is that and perhaps the answer is that if you're in other systems, by comparison, community or an individual is a client of that system. So if you're going to a doctor or if you're going to a hospital, you're a patient, and so you receive something from that system. In the national security space, what does your engagement with the national security system look like? What service are you getting from that? It's a bit more vague and amorphous, so vague, it's a bit more opaque. So I think the opportunity for exploring what a more open kind of connection with a national security conversation could look like isn't something that we've explored necessarily, because it's risky to do that. And I'm not suggesting that governments, at least here in Australia, aren't trying things. And there was a great question in the chat about what we might do about employing more abductive ways of working. And at least here in the Australian context, and my exposure to the American system tells me that organizations are working really hard to collaborate with each other. They're trying to find ways to cut the red tape and make the system work. But I guess what I'm arguing is that not that the system is broken, but I think if we need a fundamentally new way of working, cobbling together a Frankenstein and trying to bolt on other things isn't necessarily going to work. And so I just wanted to close the answer off by saying I'm aware that at least in the Australian context, there's a lot of innovation going on, in the regulatory space with regulatory sandboxes. How do we create safe spaces for people to have these conversations? I'm just opening it up for a question to us all. What would experimentation look like for us to have those dialogues, those conversations with community in a way that's safe, that government doesn't feel like they have to compromise the things around information that they have to keep safe for very legitimate, important reasons, but can also involve community in a way to help inform and shape the lives that we are all living in this space together. So that's my response to that really important but tricky question.
We have a follow-up question almost by Samuel Lum.
So I work in DC and just started in the Global Tech Development Program at the ASU school here, and I loved this. My first time attending this, it was just wonderful to hear all the tidbits of research that you're doing. It's quite different than my kind of background. I'm an engineer by trade, but something that was super fascinating because since I graduated school, I've done two things. One of them, I was a patent examiner in the U.S. Patent Office. And then my current role is where I work in standards in the health department in the United States. And the two things about patents and standards is at first, everybody in the US, they always think about like, I just want to be a small town garage inventor. And it comes up with some kind of like brand new thing, right? It's often so logical, but nobody ever like knows it. And then suddenly they run to the patent office and they try to make some big company off of it, or some licensing deal or something. And I see that as one point, and that idea was supposed to be when like the founding fathers sort of thought about it in Congress. They were like, this is really supposed to be in the public interest, right? It's the 20-year exclusivity in exchange for disclosure, right? You would outline all of your technologies, whether IT or whatever it may be. And then on the standard side, it's also a public-facing thing because it is not exclusive, but instead it tries to take into account all of the stakeholders. Not only would it involve groups and organizations locally, but it could involve, of course, governments like where I work and across the border, and be the basis of multilateral agreements, free trade agreements, and beyond at the World Trade Organization. So there's a whole complex system, I think it's all part of innovation. It's all part of ways to do that. But I think when everyone started talking more about how did that relate to national security and how do we foster and continue to foster that relationship between there's so much to unpack there that I don't think I could really get into now. But I think the U.S. has shown a lot of examples where on the national security side, like today I was looking at trade. So this is where standards comes up in trade a lot, and it's considered a national security issue. At the cabinet level of government, there are interagency panels that are trying to break down the silos between all of the different government agencies. So for trade, that can go as far as the U.S. agriculture agency, but include the Homeland Security Department and the state and the cabinet of the president and stuff. So it can span 12 different agencies, and so those are all, I think, beyond the public's reach, of course. But I agree, Mariana, you mentioned that you clearly see examples of where, for example, the U.S. Health Department reaching out to patient consortium and saying, we're going to make that a key part of how we formulate our guidance. We want to make sure our clinical trials include a diverse patient population. We want your thoughts. In fact, they just held a 3-hour meeting last week, literally featuring patients and just talking about the process and how they felt in the healthcare system, and so that the regulators could see what that process looks like. I think there's siloed versions of this still, and I agree the process is not homogeneous in these spaces. I think it's hard to put the burden on the public to be like, look, there's so much, I want your comment on everything, So I don't know, I'm interested in exploring this more, but that's just fascinating. So thank you so much for presenting.
Maybe I'll just quickly jump in. Look, I really appreciate, Samuel, your commentary and just hearing your experiences in your context. There's a lot there in what I heard, but I thought it also brilliantly connected to one of the questions I saw in the chats. I think it was from Deva. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but the question around the national security apparatus and what does creativity or engagement with community, to your point, Samuel, mean in the national security space. And I guess one final thing I just wanted to share or put out there, it is something that I've personally been thinking about a lot. I put a thought piece, a mental provocation in 2020 that you can read if you're interested. I suggested that maybe what we need is a different type of function. I called it systemic intelligence. And I don't want it to be creating something new for the sake of creating something new, but I really do believe that, at least here in the Australian context, there's a lot of pressure for organizations to do more with less. And I don't believe that trying to add on additional functions to do something different, if your responsibility is to advise on risk and harm, and that's a really important function, maybe there needs to be a new home where these other approaches can be embraced and endorsed. And so what I observe from experience is that, again, practitioners are really pushed and encouraged to think creatively, try and collaborate, be motivated, be curious, take a risk. These are all things that as individuals we're promoted and encouraged to do, but these are also high risk environments. And so if the norms and existing practices around you, like within an organization, also suggest that it's too dangerous to do some of those things, innovation's not going to thrive. It might work in some components, but it's not going to be long lasting. So fundamentally, I really do think that if we want to imagine the world in a different way, we need to create organizations and structures that embed these more innovative ways of thinking and sort of grow these norms from the outset, rather than trying to wedge them into spaces that already exist. The cultural practices, the norms need to align with the function of that organization. So I just wanted to reiterate that it is a tricky thing, but I really think that I don't think that necessarily my journal article is the answer, but systemic intelligence, there you go. It's a thought that I'm putting out there. Maybe we need a completely different function of intelligence that is dedicated to thinking about how do we collaborate better with community. And finally, just to your point, Samuel, I think your point around burdening the community is also an interesting point as well. How do we create spaces for people to feel like they can get involved without it feeling too heavy for them, too difficult? So these are all really interesting and challenging things to think about, but worthy. I think they're great and important things to think about. Gabriel, interested in your thoughts as well.
Thanks. I'm going to riff off you and a bit off Samuel. So the dilemma that I see is that we can't do it all, right? So how do we prioritize so that, you know, even if we said that even if every man, woman and child became a social scientist, we couldn't answer all the social science questions. And, you know, even if every man, woman and child devoted themselves entirely to what we've been talking about, so how to think more creatively and productively and systemically about the challenges that face the world, the kind of work, and not just the negative side, as you said, and the kind of world we want to live in, we can't do it all. And we've got a system that's already really focused on, so we've had thousands of years of development which have been incredibly productive, that have brought us to where we are, which for some of us is fabulous, and for the bulk of the world is pretty bloody miserable. How do we, you know, it's the dilemma of how we carve out space and time, of which we need an enormous amount to do the sorts of things that we're thinking about, is one that I can't get my head around. And it's easier to just keep putting one foot in front of the other and, you know, doing what you can do. I'm always a bit wary of people who call for a complete rethink, because but it's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to solve the dilemma that we just have a limited capacity to do what needs to be done. And I don't know how we deal with that.
May I jump in, Gabriel? Maybe it's a question just to build on that. Do you think that perhaps part of that is around something in your presentation? You mentioned Western approaches. Does it come down to also what we value as a society as well? So if we always prioritize the quick wins, the things that are pressing in that moment, how do we give ourselves and respect the time it takes to think about these bigger issues?
Yeah, quite. But you know, it's not that what's pressing isn't important, right? So we can all fill our days doing important, pressing stuff, and urgent stuff even. And you know, I think that your field, from the bit that I know about it, and I sit in on some conversations, you know, so let me just use that as an example. So I sit in on some conversations that the intelligence community has, which are focused very much on games and using games to model the world, right? And an inordinate amount of time and effort can go into building a better game to model the world. It's an important thing to do. Is it the most important thing that we should be doing? And you know, and it's really, once you're kind of down that track and you've got a bunch of people who are invested in doing that, then changing, you know, you can't really say, well, it's not important, because it is, because it helps us, you know, it helps people model defence capability and what needs to be done. But it's, you know, the bit we haven't, we're getting, so I guess we've taken a first step in that we've kind of opened the door and said, hey guys, and one of the things I thought about in Samuel's talk, Samuel's bit, which I'm now illustrating, is the hand waving index. I think we're at the extreme hand waving part of what we do, and while we're in the extreme hand waving part, it means that we're still kind of grappling with it, right? So we've kind of opened the door, we've opened the thinking, but what we don't yet have is a productive way forward.
I just, you know, Mariana, you brought up like values at the outset, and Gabriel, you brought up culture, and I thought that was very interesting because, you know, it's, you know, I think it's great to have sort of this top-down policy making, and like, hey, like we, like, especially as an agency, we're very traditional. Like, oh yeah, we're, you know, someone at the top needs to say this kind of thing. Like we want to promote this in the public.
Thank you for that wonderful closing comment, Samuel. To all our guests, thank you for coming again. To our special guests, they were two of the most concise, I would say, talks with big picture themes. We thank you so much for the preparation, for the colloquium, for the conciseness, the masterclasses, and also exposure, Gabriel, to your IT insights at ANU, to your research, Mariana, and your research work in process. We can't wait to see where that will go next. I know there's a multiplicity of avenues, but to everybody, if you'd like to see the rerun of this video, it'll be available on the School for the Future of Innovation in Society YouTube website, in addition to IEEE.tv. Please share it and share the ideas around public interest technology, transdisciplinarity, and all of those themes that we touched on today, because I think they are the ways of the future. We have so much gratitude for starting the conversation in this space, particularly in the intelligence space, and also, Gabriel, more broadly in the work that you're doing. So thank you very much to our speakers, and may we see you again next week.